Wisdom, wisdom, that's the test. Which rival wisdom team is best? 52 teams of 8 antique rival wisdoms that have passed the test of time to encourage, educate and entertain generations for centuries.
Team 11 unite with courage. Quote definitions, biographical context, and synergy analysis to replace hate with motivational education to guidealife.com. Quote 11.1. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865. Quote definition. A community, nation, or family that is fundamentally split against itself, committed to irreconcilably opposed purposes, cannot maintain its integrity or survive as a functioning whole. Internal division, left unresolved, is a structural failure that brings the entire edifice down. Quote application. Hatred divides. Wisdom and kindness unite. The entire replacehate.org mission rests on Lincoln's structural insight. A society that cannot find common ground in basic human dignity will not stand. Every effort to replace hate with wisdom is an act of structural repair, reinforcing the beams that division is rotting away. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, to a poor farming family that moved repeatedly through Indiana before settling in Illinois. He had less than a year of formal schooling in total, teaching himself law by reading borrowed books by firelight and working as a rail splitter, flatboat operator, store clerk, and postmaster before becoming a self-taught attorney and then a politician. He served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature and 1 term in the U.S. Congress before his debates with Stephen Douglas over the extension of slavery brought him national attention and eventually the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. The House Divided speech was delivered on June 16, 1858, in Springfield, Illinois, upon Lincoln's acceptance of the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. His advisers urged him not to deliver it. The opening line, drawn from the Gospel of Mark, was considered too radical, too incendiary, too likely to alienate moderate voters. Lincoln kept it. He had concluded that the nation could not continue indefinitely half-slave and half-free, not as a political preference, but as a structural analysis. A government founded on the proposition that all men are created equal could not permanently coexist with an institution that denied that proposition to millions of people. The division would resolve itself one way or another. He was right, and the Civil War proved it at catastrophic cost. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Recognize internal division in families, communities, organizations, and nations as a structural threat, not merely a social inconvenience. 2. Address fundamental contradictions rather than papering over them, because unresolved divisions compound over time. 3. Invest in the shared foundations, common values, common dignity, common purpose, that allow diverse people to stand together. 4. Understand that unity is not uniformity. It is the shared commitment to enough common ground that the structure holds. Lincoln himself was the most practical illustration of this principle. He built a cabinet of rivals, men who had competed against him for the presidency and disagreed with him on fundamental questions, because he understood that winning the war required the best available talent, united around a common purpose, regardless of internal disagreements. He held a house divided together by finding the common ground beneath the division, the survival of democratic government itself.
Quote 11.2. There are times when the greatest change needed is my viewpoint. Denis Diderot, 1713 to 1784. Quote definition. The most significant and most available transformation in any difficult situation is often not a change in external circumstances, other people's behavior, or the world's arrangements, but a fundamental shift in one's own perspective, assumptions, and framing of what is happening. Quote application. Hatred is largely a viewpoint problem, a failure to see the full humanity of people who are different. Diderot's insight is the prescription. The change most needed most often is in how we see. Replacing hate requires replacing the viewpoints that make hate seem reasonable, and that replacement begins in the individual mind before it can spread to communities. Denis Diderot was born in 1713 in Langres, France, the son of a master cutler, a craftsman of knives and surgical instruments, who gave him an excellent Jesuit education with the expectation that he would enter the church. Diderot had other ideas. He moved to Paris, broke with his family, lived in bohemian poverty for years, married against his father's wishes, and embarked on a career as a writer, philosopher, and intellectual provocateur that would make him one of the central figures of the French Enlightenment. His most consequential project was the Encyclopédie, a massive collaborative work he co-edited with D'Alembert that attempted to compile all human knowledge and, more subversively, to organize and present it in ways that challenged church authority and aristocratic privilege. The project consumed 20 years of his life, was banned twice by French authorities, and is now recognized as one of the founding documents of the modern world. Diderot's observation about viewpoint change emerges from a philosophy deeply committed to the revision of inherited assumptions. The entire Encyclopédie project was premised on the idea that most of what people believed was the product of uncritical reception of tradition rather than genuine inquiry, and that the most important intellectual act available to any person was to examine those inherited assumptions and revise the ones that couldn't survive scrutiny. He applied this principle to himself as vigorously as to his era's institutions. His private writings, particularly the posthumously published Rameau's Nephew and Jacques the Fatalist, are experiments in destabilizing comfortable viewpoints, including his own. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Develop the habit of asking in difficult situations, what change in my viewpoint would alter what I am seeing? 2. Recognize the enormous leverage available in perspective shifts. The same facts can look entirely different from a different vantage point. 3. Practice intellectual humility as an active discipline, assuming that current viewpoints are incomplete rather than final. 4. Apply viewpoint change as a tool for empathy. Seeing through someone else's eyes is one of the most direct routes to replacing prejudice with understanding. Diderot changed his own viewpoints repeatedly and publicly across his career, on religion, on politics, on aesthetics, on human nature, and documented those changes in writing that remains startlingly alive today precisely because it captures the authentic experience of a mind genuinely willing to revise itself. He modeled what he prescribed, the willingness to let the greatest change begin within.
Quote 11.3. Resolve and thou art free. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow 1807–1882. Quote definition. The act of genuine resolution, making a firm, committed decision about who you are and what you stand for, is itself the mechanism of freedom. You do not become free by waiting for circumstances to improve. You become free by resolving to act, think, and live as a free person. Quote application. For anyone trapped in the mental habits of hatred, resentment, or fear, Longfellow's principle is the key. The freedom from those habits begins not with changed circumstances but with a resolved will. And for anyone working to spread wisdom and kindness, resolve is the internal resource that makes sustained commitment possible regardless of external conditions. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was born in 1807 in Portland, Maine into a prominent New England family that gave him a thorough education at Bowdoin College, where his classmate was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and then supported his study of modern languages in Europe for several years. He became a professor of modern languages at Harvard, one of the most respected literary figures in mid-19th century America, and the author of narrative poems, Evangeline, The Song of Hiawatha, Paul Revere's Ride, that were read by virtually every educated American of his era. He was the first American poet whose bust was placed in the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. The personal context of this quote matters enormously. In 1861, Longfellow's wife Fanny caught fire when sealing wax ignited her dress and died the following day from her burns. Longfellow, who tried desperately to extinguish the flames and suffered burns to his own face and hands, was devastated to a degree he described as making life itself almost unbearable. He could not attend her funeral. 4 years he battled grief so severe that he later described the period as his long darkness. His response, documented in his journals and letters, was a deliberate act of will, the resolution to continue living, writing, working, and caring for his children despite the grief. Resolve and thou art free was not abstract philosophy for Longfellow. It was the daily prescription he applied to himself. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Understand freedom as an internal condition that begins with a decision, not an external condition that arrives with changed circumstances. 2. Practice resolution as an active discipline, not a one-time declaration but a daily renewal of commitment. 3. Recognize the liberating power available in genuine decisiveness, the freedom that follows from knowing clearly what you stand for. 4. Apply this principle to the mental habits that imprison. Hatred, resentment, fear, and despair can all be addressed by a sufficiently firm resolve to transcend them. Longfellow translated Dante's Divine Comedy during the years of his deepest grief, a project requiring enormous concentration, technical skill, and sustained creative engagement. The translation is considered one of the finest in English. He resolved to work, and in the working found a form of freedom from the grief that could have consumed him. His life was the proof of his principle.
Quote 11.4. Freedom is a system based on courage. Charles Pegouis, 1873 to 1914. Quote definition. Freedom is not a passive condition maintained by legal declarations or constitutional guarantees alone. It is an active system, an ongoing achievement that requires the continuous exercise of courage by the people who inhabit it. Freedom without the courage to defend, exercise, and extend it gradually ceases to be freedom at all. Quote application. The freedom to live wisely, act kindly, and speak the truth in a society saturated with hatred and division requires exactly the courage Pegouis describes. Freedom does not maintain itself. Every generation must choose it actively, and choosing it actively requires courage, especially when the easier path is silence, conformity, or indifference. Charles Pegouis was born in 1873 in Orleans, France, the son of a chairmender who died when Pegouis was less than a year old. He was raised in poverty by his mother and grandmother, received a scholarship education that eventually took him to the École Normale Supérieure, the most elite educational institution in France, and became a poet, essayist, and publisher whose work is difficult to categorize politically or religiously because it refused to belong to any party. He was a socialist who became a Catholic, a Dreyfusard who broke with the organized Dreyfus movement, a patriot who was fiercely critical of French political institutions. He founded and edited a journal, Cahiers de la Quinzaine, for 14 years, writing much of it himself and publishing work by writers including Romain Rolland and Julien Benda. He refused to compromise his editorial independence for financial survival, living in chronic poverty to maintain it. Pegouis' understanding of freedom as a system based on courage came from a life spent watching what happened when courage failed. When people stayed silent about the Dreyfus injustice because speaking was inconvenient, when intellectuals deferred to institutions whose corruption they privately recognized, when the comfortable consensus of the era chose the path of least resistance over the path of honest engagement. He had paid personally for his courageous positions, financial hardship, professional isolation, broken friendships, and he had concluded that this was simply the price of freedom. He was killed in action on September 5th, 1914, the day before the First Battle of the Marne, having enlisted at 41 as a lieutenant despite his age and despite having young children. He died as he had lived, acting on his convictions regardless of the cost. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Understand freedom as an active, ongoing achievement requiring continuous maintenance, not a passive inheritance requiring only enjoyment. 2. Recognize that the courage required to sustain freedom includes the courage to speak, to dissent, to refuse comfortable silence. 3. Accept that the cost of freedom, born in courage, is the price of maintaining it, and that refusing to pay that price is a form of surrender. 4. Apply this principle to the specific freedom required by the Replace Hate mission. The courage to name hatred, oppose it publicly, and model the alternative. Pegouis' Cahiers de la Quinzaine ran for 14 years on courage alone. Financial courage to refuse profitable compromise, intellectual courage to publish unpopular views, personal courage to sustain positions that isolated him from every organized political and religious movement of his era. He built freedom, one courageous editorial decision at a time. His journal outlasted every comfortable institution that had dismissed it.
Quote 11.5 Suspicion is the cancer of friendship. Petrarch 1304 to 1374. Quote definition. Suspicion, the persistent, unfounded distrust that poisons the interpretation of another person's motives and actions, destroys friendship from the inside with the same relentless, consuming progression as cancer destroys healthy tissue. Once fully established, it is nearly impossible to reverse. Quote application. Hatred is organized suspicion. It interprets entire groups of people through a lens of assumed malice, threat, and unworthiness. Petrarch's medical metaphor names exactly what hatred does to the possibility of human connection. It makes genuine friendship, trust, and community impossible by turning every interaction into a confirmation of threat. Wisdom replaces suspicion with earned trust and genuine encounter. Francesco Petrarca, Petrarch, was born in 1304 in Arezzo, Tuscany, the son of a notary who had been exiled from Florence alongside Dante Alighieri. He spent his childhood in Avignon, France, where the papal court was then located, received an excellent education in classical literature, and fell into obsessive love with a woman he called Laura, whom he may have glimpsed only once in church, and whose idealized image inspired over 300 sonnets and canzoniere that established the Italian sonnet form that Shakespeare and Spenser would later adopt. He is called the father of humanism for his role in recovering, editing, and promoting the classical Latin texts that would fuel the Renaissance, and his letters, addressed to Cicero, Livy, and Virgil as though writing to living contemporaries, embody the humanist project of recovering antiquity as a living resource rather than a dead archive. Petrarch's observation about suspicion emerges from a life unusually rich in both deep friendship and painful betrayal. He cultivated friendships with extraordinary care. His Latin treatise De Amicitia, on friendship, was a lifelong preoccupation, and he experienced the destruction of several important relationships through the corrosive effects of misunderstanding, jealousy, and mistrust. The cancer metaphor is precise. Cancer does not announce itself loudly. It works quietly from within, consuming what was healthy, and by the time its damage is visible, the cure is often too late. Petrarch had seen suspicion do exactly this to friendships he valued, and he named the mechanism with the precision of a diagnostician who had watched it operate at close range. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Treat unfounded suspicion as a medical emergency in relationships, something requiring immediate, honest attention before it spreads. 2. Distinguish between prudent caution based on evidence and corrosive suspicion based on fear or prejudice. 3. Actively resist the habit of interpreting others' actions through the most threatening available lens. 4. Recognize that sustained suspicion of a person or group makes genuine human connection with them functionally impossible. Petrarch's most important friendship was with Giovanni Boccaccio, the author of the Decameron, with whom he corresponded for decades in a relationship of mutual admiration, intellectual stimulation, and genuine affection. That friendship was maintained partly through Petrarch's explicit commitment to honest communication and charitable interpretation, the antidote he practiced to the cancer he named. Their correspondence, preserved across nearly 7 centuries, is one of the most beautiful records of intellectual friendship in Western literature.
Quote 11.6. Man is only great when he acts from passion. Benjamin Disraeli, 1804 to 1881. Quote definition. Genuine greatness, the kind that produces significant and lasting achievement, requires more than skill, strategy, or intelligence. It requires passion, the deep, animating commitment to something that matters enough to sustain extraordinary effort over time and through difficulty. Quote application. The work of replacing hate with wisdom is not a task that can be sustained by obligation, policy, or strategy alone. It requires the passion that Disraeli names, a genuine, burning conviction that human dignity matters, that wisdom is worth spreading, that kindness is worth fighting for. Passion is what separates people who make a real difference from people who make a brief appearance. Benjamin Disraeli was born in 1804 in London to a Jewish family. His father, Isaac Disraeli, was a literary scholar and writer, and was baptized into the Church of England at 12 when his father broke with the local synagogue. He grew up in a literary household, published his first novel at 22, and spent the next several decades as simultaneously one of England's most popular novelists and one of its most controversial politicians. Flamboyant, witty, and frequently dismissed by the conservative establishment he was trying to lead. He was mocked for his Jewish heritage, his dandyish appearance, his purple prose, and his theatrical speaking style. He persisted anyway, becoming prime minister twice, championing working-class reform legislation that his own party's establishment opposed, and guiding Britain to the purchase of the Suez Canal in one of the most consequential diplomatic maneuvers of the Victorian era. Disraeli's principle about passion was not abstract. It was autobiographical. He had watched cautious, competent, strategically sophisticated politicians accomplish very little, while passionate conviction, even when it arrived in unconventional forms, moved mountains. His own career was driven by a genuine passion for Britain's imperial destiny and for the social elevation of the working class. Causes that seemed contradictory to many contemporaries, but that Disraeli pursued with the consistency of deep conviction. His novels, Coningsby, Sybil, Tancred, were passion projects as much as entertainments, vehicles for ideas he cared about too much to leave only to political speeches. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Identify and cultivate the genuine passion, the deep why, that can sustain significant effort through the inevitable difficulties of meaningful work. 2. Distinguish between competent performance driven by obligation and great achievement driven by conviction. 3. Trust passion as a reliable guide to where one's greatest contributions can be made. What you care about most deeply is often where you can do the most. 4. Recognize that passion without direction becomes mere energy, but direction without passion becomes mere motion. Both are required for greatness. Disraeli's final act of passion was characteristic. Dying in 1881, he declined a visit from Queen Victoria, with whom he had maintained one of the most remarkable friendships in British political history, saying he preferred not to see her, since she would only ask him to deliver a message to Prince Albert, and he was sure he could find a more convenient opportunity. The wit was deliberate. He refused to make his death sentimental. He had acted from passion his entire life. He exited with the same style. The Queen wept.
Quote 11.7. Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever. Thomas More, 1779 to 1852. Quote definition. The reputation and recognition that come from significant achievement are temporary. History is full of figures once famous who are now forgotten. But the alternative, never attempting anything significant, living in the permanent obscurity of unexpressed potential, is a permanence of a far more troubling kind. Quote application. This quote is the case for attempting something meaningful rather than choosing the safety of inconsequence. For anyone hesitating to speak truth, pursue wisdom, or stand against hatred because the effort might be forgotten, More's observation reverses the risk calculation. The temporary nature of glory is less concerning than the permanent nature of never having tried. Thomas More was born in 1779 in Dublin, Ireland, the son of a Catholic grocer, and became the most celebrated Irish poet of his era, the Bard of Erin, author of Irish melodies whose songs were sung in drawing rooms across the English-speaking world. He was a close friend of Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, a gifted satirist whose political lampoons targeted both British policy in Ireland and American political figures, and a biographer whose life of Byron was commissioned on the strength of the personal letters Byron had entrusted to him. Letters more controversially burned in consultation with Byron's family after deciding they were too scandalous to publish. More's observation about the relative permanence of obscurity versus glory reflects a characteristically Irish awareness of history's capacity to forget. He had grown up in a colonized country whose own cultural history had been systematically suppressed, whose greatest achievements had been attributed to others or simply erased, and whose people were in genuine danger of disappearing into the obscurity that colonial erasure creates. His Irish melodies were a direct response to that threat, an attempt to preserve, celebrate, and transmit Irish cultural identity through music that would be too beautiful and too popular to ignore. He understood that doing nothing in the face of cultural destruction was a permanent choice, while the attempt to create, however imperfect, at least left something in the world. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Reframe the risk calculation around attempting meaningful work. The risk of obscurity through inaction is greater than the risk of impermanence through action. 2. Recognize that the temporary nature of glory is not a reason to avoid seeking it. It is simply an honest description of the condition under which all human achievement exists. 3. Act on the conviction that attempting something significant, even if ultimately forgotten, is preferable to the permanent obscurity of never having tried. 4. Apply this principle to the mission of spreading wisdom. Even imperfect efforts leave something in the world that the silence of inaction never does. Thomas More's Irish melodies were the most popular songs in the English-speaking world for much of the 19th century. Most people today cannot name a single one. But they changed how the Irish understood themselves and how the English understood Ireland at a critical moment in the relationship between those two peoples. The glory was temporary, the impact was real. Obscurity, for those songs, was never an option Moore was willing to choose.
Quote 11.8. Don't count your years, make your years count. George Meredith, 1828 to 1909. Quote definition. The measure of a life is not its length, the accumulation of years passively endured, but the quality, purpose, and impact of what those years contained. Making years count is an active, intentional project. Counting them is merely arithmetic. Quote application. For the mission of making America wiser and kinder, Meredith's principle is the operating standard. Every year, every month, every day is an opportunity to make a contribution. Age is irrelevant as a measure of value. What matters is what the time was used for and whether it moved the mission forward. George Meredith was born in 1828 in Portsmouth, England. The son of a tailor, a social origin he was so ashamed of that he spent much of his life concealing it, claiming a more genteel background than he possessed. He became a novelist and poet whose work was admired enormously by other writers, Thomas Hardy, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Oscar Wilde among them, but who was considered too intellectually demanding for popular audiences and never achieved the mass readership of Dickens or Thackeray during his lifetime. His novel The Egoist is now considered a masterpiece of psychological fiction. His sequence of 50 interconnected sonnets, Modern Love, about the dissolution of his first marriage, is one of the most psychologically acute works of Victorian poetry. Meredith spent the last 25 years of his life in increasing physical pain from locomotor ataxia, a degenerative neurological condition that progressively impaired his movement, and yet continued writing, corresponding, receiving visitors, and engaging with the literary world until near the end of his life. He received the Order of Merit from Edward VII in 1905, an honor he shared with Hardy and Swinburne. His principle about making years count rather than counting them was not philosophical consolation, it was his actual operating method. He wrote The Egoist in his 50s, continued producing significant work in his 60s and 70s, and remained intellectually engaged into his 80s despite constant pain. He made every year count because counting them had never seemed like a useful activity. This quote specifically encourages individuals to 1. Shift the primary measure of a life from duration to quality of engagement and contribution. 2. Resist the tendency to treat age, whether youth or old age, as a reason to defer meaningful action. 3. Invest in making the current year count rather than waiting for a better year that may or may not arrive. 4. Apply the standard to every unit of time. What is being made of it, and is that what it deserves? George Meredith's literary reputation declined sharply after his death. He is no longer widely read by general audiences, but his influence on the writers who admired him shaped the development of the psychological novel in ways that persist in every serious novel written since. His years counted in ways he would not have been able to predict or quantify. That is often how it works. The counting comes later, if at all, and the making is what matters now.
How they work together as a unified philosophy to replace hate and guide a life with motivational education for all. The Unite with Courage framework. Foundation layer. Unity and the interchange that makes it possible. Quotes 1-2. Lincoln. Establish the structural truth. Division destroys what it inhabits, and only unity preserves the house, as the non-negotiable starting point for any serious social mission. Diderot. Identify the primary instrument of unity available to every individual. The willingness to change one's own viewpoint, as often the most powerful change available, preceding and enabling all external change. Together, establish both the goal and the mechanism. Lincoln names what is at stake. Division will bring the house down, while Diderot names the most accessible lever for preventing it, the individual's willingness to revise their own perspective. Unity cannot be imposed from outside. It is built from within, one revised viewpoint at a time. Without Lincoln, Diderot's self-revision lacks urgency. Without Diderot, Lincoln's call for unity lacks a practical starting point. Liberation layer. Resolve and courage as the architecture of freedom, quotes 3-4. Longfellow, name resolution, the firm internal decision, as the specific act that makes freedom real, available to anyone willing to make it regardless of external circumstances. Pigouis, reveal the structural truth about freedom itself, that it is not a passive inheritance, but an active system requiring the continuous exercise of courage to maintain and extend. Together, build the complete architecture of freedom as an internal achievement. Longfellow provides the ignition, resolve, and you are free, while Pigouis provides the fuel system. That freedom, once achieved through resolution, requires ongoing courage to sustain. Together they describe freedom not as a gift received, but as a system built and maintained, one courageous resolution at a time. Relationship layer, trust and passionate engagement, quotes 5-6. Petrarch, protect the relationships that unity depends on by naming and resisting suspicion, the cancer that destroys friendship from within, as the primary threat to genuine human connection. Disraeli, provide the animating energy that sustains the work of building unity, passion, the deep conviction that what we are doing matters, as the force that elevates effort from competent performance to genuine greatness. Together, identify the emotional and relational conditions that make united, courageous action possible and sustainable. Petrarch guards the negative space, removing the corrosive suspicion that dissolves the trust on which unity rests, while Disraeli fills the positive space with the passion that makes sustained effort not just possible but great. A house united but passionless goes through the motions. A house passionate but riddled with suspicion tears itself apart. Together, these two quotes describe the healthy relational culture of a genuine movement. Legacy layer, the right risk and the right measure, quotes 7-8. More, reframe the risk of meaningful action. Glory is temporary but obscurity is permanent, so that the calculation favors attempting something significant over the false safety of consequence-free inaction. Meredith, provide the operating standard that governs every year of the mission. Make the years count rather than merely counting them, as the daily discipline that converts resolve and passion into accumulated impact. Together, complete the framework by addressing both the motivation to begin and the standard by which to live. Moore removes the paralysis of risk aversion by reversing the risk calculation. Meredith provides the daily metric that converts the motivation to begin into the discipline to continue. Together they ensure that the united, courageous, trusting, passionate house Lincoln called for is not just built but maintained and made to count, year after year, regardless of whether glory comes or goes.
Free Easy Extra Advantage Math, Spelling and Reading Workbooks you can download for free at stop2think.com or buy at educationstopshate.com. Free Easy Math Wisdom Workbooks with octo repetition to grow math self-confidence. You'll get plenty of repetitive practice of age ranges and averages of our 52 teams of 8 quote authors. Free Easy Alpha Cipher-coded puzzles teach letters, numbers, and phrases using antique wisdoms that encourage and educate. Can you decode this cipher quote of encouragement using either our Learning to Spell or just for fun instructions? And since time is money, practice reading faster with 52 teams of antique rival wisdoms that have passed the test of time to encourage, educate, and entertain generations for centuries. We offer printed versions and timed videos with background music. Sign up for free weekly emails of 52 teams of antique rival wisdom workbooks with easy math, spelling, and reading practice. And, if you'd like to get paid for sharing our wearable wisdoms, keep this in mind. Everyone I know wears a shirt, and most of us change them daily, so change your shirt and change the world. Social equalities are blatantly subliminal antique positive wisdoms repetitively shared without saying a word. This applies to all our wearable shareable wisdoms. Like pretty witty baby onesies and baby tees that you and others will see and read multiple times a day. The same is true with pretty witty kids, but they'll also share these wisdoms with anyone that can read at daycare or school. Youthful truths let your kids gain confidence sharing antique wisdoms with their friends. Imagine them sharing words of wisdom with classmates and teachers. Therefore I think tees I wear is a super easy way to share words of wisdom that have passed the test of time. Our social equalities help make us all wiser and kinder with blatantly subliminal messages promoting a more fair and equal opportunity society for all. And don't forget our giftwisdoms.com for birthdays and holidays that makes it easy to share the wisdom with clothing, coffee mugs, and magnets. So do the future a favor by encouraging, educating and entertaining with words of wisdom that have passed the test of time to make us all wiser and kinder. With wearable wisdoms to fit babies, kids, and adults. You can clothe a whole family, city or state. Join the 52 of 8 today.